I was part of a small team sent to the forest that night. We got a call earlier about something strange going on deep in the woods. It seemed like it would be an easy job. Go in, check things out, make sure nothing illegal was happening, and head back. Simple enough. I had done stuff like this a bunch of times before. When we started walking into the forest, something felt off. The air was thick, like it was hard to breathe. The deeper we went, the more it felt like the trees were closing in on us. Their branches blocked out most of the moonlight, leaving everything dark and quiet. Our flashlights lit up parts of the trees, but the shadows they made looked like things were moving just out of sight. But there was nothing there, just the sound of our boots hitting the ground and the crunch of dry leaves underfoot. After about an hour of walking, we came to a small open space. It looked like someone had camped there not long ago. There were some burned logs in a circle and footprints in the dirt. They led further into the woods, so we followed them. The trail led us to a part of the forest that felt wrong. The trees were taller here, and the branches were thick and twisted. The ground was soft, like wet dirt, and it made me feel uneasy. The more we walked, the worse everything seemed. The forest felt alive in a way it shouldn't, like it wasn't just trees and animals. Felt like it was watching us. Then we found something weird. Between two trees, there was an old rope, worn out and frayed. It had been there for a long time, but what made my stomach turn was what was hanging from it. There were small animal bones, tied together in some strange way. I didn't know what it meant, but it felt like a warning, something telling us to turn back. We kept going, even though everything in me was telling me we shouldn't. The deeper we went, the darker it got. The trees grew closer together, and the air seemed to get thicker. That's when I heard it, a quiet rustling, like something moving just out of sight. I stopped, shining my light around, but there was nothing. Then the first guy disappeared. He was just a few feet in front of me, walking along, and then he was gone. No sound, no sign of struggle, just gone. 1 second he was there, the next he wasn't. We searched for him, pointing our flashlights everywhere, but there was nothing. No footprints, no marks, just empty space where he had been. That's when panic started to creep in. We grouped up, trying to figure out what to do, but before we could, it happened again. Another guy, this time right beside me, vanished. I didn't see it happen. I looked away for just a second, and when I turned back, he was gone. That's when I realized we needed to leave. We turned around to go back the way we came, but the trail was gone. It was like the forest had swallowed it up. Every direction looked the same, just trees stretching out forever. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the weight of what was happening. This wasn't just some normal search anymore. We were being hunted. We tried to move fast, hoping we could find our way out, but the forest was twisting around us. The rustling sounds got louder, like whatever was out there was getting closer. My flashlight started flickering, and I could feel eyes on me. It wasn't just my imagination anymore. Something was out there, following us. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. It was quick, darting between the trees. I aimed my flashlight at it, but by the time the light hit, it was gone. My breathing was rough, and fear was squeezing my chest. Whatever it wasn't waiting much longer. I could feel it circling us, closing in. In the end, I was the only one left. I don't remember how I made it out of the forest, but I did. I stumbled out, falling to the ground, gasping for air. My body was shaking uncontrollably. Everyone else was gone. No sign of them, not a single trace. I filed my report, but no one believed me. They sent more teams in, but nothing came back. No camp, no tracks, nothing. Like we were never there at all. I don't know what was in that forest, but I know one thing for sure. It's still out there. It knows how to make people disappear without a sound, without a struggle. And it's still waiting, hidden in the trees, watching. I had been walking through the thick forest in South America for 2 days. My backpack felt heavier with each step, and the heat was unbearable. The trees stretched out as far as I could see, and the tall branches above made it hard to breathe. I had heard the jungle could feel like too much, but no one told me how quiet it could get the deeper I went. It happened slowly. At first, the jungle sounds were normal: birds, bugs, the wind in the leaves. Then, little by little, they started fading. I thought maybe I had just gotten used to the noise, but after a while, it hit me. Everything was quiet. No birds, no buzzing, just my own footsteps crunching on the ground. I kept moving, trying to ignore the bad feeling growing in my stomach. The path I was following had been easy to see at first, but now the vines and bushes were taking over, making it harder to walk. I had a map, but with all the trees and plants around, it was impossible to know where I really was. After walking for another hour, I saw something odd. There was a pile of stones, neatly stacked in a small open space. They didn't look like they belonged there. Someone had definitely put them there. I stopped and stared at them, confused. I hadn't seen anyone else since I entered the forest. I kept walking, but that weird feeling in my gut only got worse. I came across 2 more of those stone piles, each one bigger than the last. The air felt thicker, and my skin tingled. It was like I was being watched, but no matter how hard I looked around, I didn't see anyone. As the sun started to go down, the forest felt like it was closing in on me. The shadows grew long, and the jungle, which had seemed so full of life before, now felt like a cage. I needed to set up camp soon, but I didn't feel safe. I found a small clearing and quickly set up my tent. It was quiet, too quiet. Night fell and I couldn't sleep. I lay in my tent, listening to the dead silence, my heart beating fast in my chest. After hours of tossing and turning, I finally dozed off. Then I heard footsteps. Slow, careful footsteps outside my tent. They weren't animal footsteps. They were too deliberate, too human. My body froze. The steps circled my tent, moving slowly around me. I stayed completely still, my mind racing, trying to figure out what was out there. My knife was nearby, but I didn't dare move. The footsteps stopped, right next to my tent. The air felt heavy, like something was standing just inches away from me. I held my breath, waiting. Felt like hours passed, but I couldn't be sure. Then, slowly, the footsteps started again, moving away into the forest. I lay there, listening until I couldn't hear them anymore. As soon as the sun came up, I packed my things. I needed to get out of there, but as I tried to follow my map, nothing looked familiar. The jungle felt different, like it was swallowing me up. Every direction I turned looked the same, endless trees blocking my view. Panic set in as I realized I might be lost. The jungle, which had been incredible just days ago, now felt like a prison. I walked for hours, hoping to find a way out. But instead, I came across another pile of stones. This one was bigger than the others, almost as tall as me. My heart sank. I hadn't seen any of these stone piles since the day before, and now they were back. I stood there, staring at it, trying to figure out what to do. Then I noticed something I hadn't before. There were scratches on the stones. Deep marks like someone or something had dragged sharp nails across them. That's when it hit me. Those stone piles weren't just random. They were markers, and whoever or whatever was out here had been using them to track me. I dropped my backpack and started walking faster, trying to put as much distance as I could between me and those stones. But no matter how fast I walked, the feeling didn't go away. Every time I looked over my shoulder, I felt it, eyes on me, watching every step I took. As I pushed deeper into the jungle, more stone piles appeared. Each one was bigger than the last. Each one seemed to say, "You're going the wrong way." By the time the sun started to set again, I knew I wasn't getting out. The jungle was playing tricks on me. It wasn't just a forest, it was a trap, and I had walked right into it. That night, I didn't set up my tent. I didn't even stop to rest. I just kept walking, knowing deep down that no matter how far I went, I wouldn't escape. The stone piles kept appearing, larger and more twisted, almost as if they were waiting for me to understand something. The scratches on the stones were deeper now, more violent, like they were made in frustration or hunger. I never saw what was following me, but as the darkness closed in and the jungle swallowed all light, I finally understood. I wasn't meant to leave, and now, I'm not sure anyone will ever find me, but whatever's been marking those stones is getting closer. It was supposed to be an easy college trip. A few of us decided to go to a forest a couple of hours away from campus. We thought it'd be a nice break from all the school stress, a good time to relax and hang out. We rented a few cabins, packed some food and stuff, and planned a couple of hikes. The forest was thick, and the cabins were pretty far from each other, but that just made it seem more exciting. On the second day, we decided to go hiking. The trail was easy to follow at first, wide enough for all of us to walk together, joking and having fun. But after about an hour, the trail got narrower, the trees taller, and the air felt heavy. It was like the forest was closing in on us. The sky, which was clear before, started getting darker as the branches above us grew thicker. Nobody was really talking anymore. We just kept moving, feeling this weird quietness around us. It wasn't the kind of quiet that makes you feel calm. It was something else. I stayed at the back of the group, keeping an eye on my friends ahead. The trail was getting harder to follow, covered with roots and broken branches. Every once in a while, I looked over my shoulder. I couldn't explain it, but I felt uneasy. Maybe it was because it was so quiet, or maybe it was the way the trees seemed to surround us, but something about it just felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't the only ones out there. After about 2 hours, we reached a small clearing. This was supposed to be our halfway point, where we could rest before turning back. But there was nothing there, just more trees. No signs, no markers, nothing to show we were in the right place. One of the guys checked the map, looking confused. That's when we realized we weren't where we thought we were. We had no idea how far off the trail we had wandered, but going back seemed like the smartest idea. We started retracing our steps, but everything looked different. The trees, the path, even the light, it all seemed wrong. The trail split off in directions we didn't remember, and before long, we were completely lost. The air was getting colder, and the sun was starting to set faster than we expected. That's when I noticed something. There were no sounds, no birds, no wind in the leaves, just the sound of our shoes crunching on the ground. With each step, my nervousness got worse. Every time I glanced back, I thought I saw something move between the trees, but when I looked closer, it was gone. As the light faded even more, the forest seemed to close in tighter around us. The trail was gone now, completely swallowed by the woods. Panic started creeping in. We had no idea which way the cabins were anymore. My heart was racing, and I knew the others felt it too. No one was talking, just speeding up, trying to get back before dark. And then we heard it. Footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps, not far behind us. At first, I thought it was just in my head, but the looks on my friends' faces told me they heard it too. We didn't say anything, but the fear was written all over us. We all started walking faster, almost jogging, pretending like it wasn't there, but the sound didn't stop. The footsteps kept following us. They matched our speed, staying just far enough behind that we couldn't see who or what was making them. We never caught sight of anyone, but the sound didn't go away, getting closer every time we slowed down. It felt like something was waiting for us to slip up, waiting for the right moment. By the time we reached a small stream, It was almost completely dark. We didn't know if it was leading us in the right direction, but we had no other choice, so we followed it, desperate to get out of the trees. That's when I saw it, a flash of light through the branches. It was the cabins. For a split second, I felt relief, but then I heard the footsteps again, right behind us, faster now. We didn't waste any time. We ran, our hearts pounding, legs burning, not daring to look back. When we reached the cabin, we slammed the door shut and locked it. The footsteps stopped right outside. We waited in silence, not even breathing, but nothing happened. No knocks, no more footsteps, just that eerie quiet again. None of us slept that night. We stayed up, listening for any sound, but the forest was dead silent. In the morning, we packed up and left without saying a word about what happened. But that feeling stuck with me. Whatever was out there, it let us go this time. But it won't stop. It's still there, waiting for someone else to step into the woods, waiting for another group to lose their way. I keep thinking about it, wondering what would have happened if we hadn't made it back to the cabins in time. We got lucky, but the next ones out there might not be so lucky. I can't help but feel like something is still following me, even now, long after we left that place. I always loved spending time with my grandfather. He didn't talk much, but he was strong, and he knew the forest behind his house better than anyone. Every summer, I'd visit him and we'd walk the trails there, the trees closing in as we went deeper. The wind barely moved through the leaves, but it always felt calm. I never felt nervous being in those woods. Not until that last summer. We left early one morning, just as the sun was coming up. The shadows were long, stretching across the ground as we walked. We planned to hike up to a high spot in the forest, eat lunch, and get back home before dark. First, everything was normal. The sound of leaves crunching under our feet, birds chirping in the distance. It was the peaceful kind of quiet I was used to, but when we stopped to rest a while, things started to feel off. The birds stopped singing. There wasn't even a breeze. No sound of animals moving around, no rustling of leaves. Just silence. My grandfather sat on a rock, sipping from his water bottle, like nothing was wrong. But something was bothering me. I looked around, trying to figure out what was different, but nothing seemed out of place. Still, the quiet made me uneasy. We kept walking, but the silence followed us. Felt heavy, like the woods were watching us. The deeper we went, the closer the trees seemed to get. My grandfather didn't say a word, just kept moving forward, eyes on the trail. I stayed close behind him, but the weird feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. After what felt like a long time, we came to a small open area. Normally, I would have felt relieved to get out of the thick trees, but something about the clearing made my skin crawl. Right in the middle of it, there was an old cabin. I had never seen it before, and by the way my grandfather stared at it, neither had he. The roof had caved in, and the windows were dark and empty. It looked abandoned, but something about it was just wrong. My grandfather stood still for a minute, just staring at the cabin. Then, without saying anything, he turned and started walking away, faster than before. I followed him, my heart beating hard in my chest. I didn't know what was going on, but I knew we had to get away from that place. As we hurried through the woods, the strange silence hung around us. The forest felt darker, the trees pressing in even more. It was like the air itself was heavy. That's when I realized we weren't on the same path we had taken to get there. My grandfather knew these woods like the back of his hand, but for the first time he looked unsure. We were lost, and that's when I noticed something else. There were no footprints in the dirt behind us, not even ours. It was like we hadn't walked that way at all. The sun started to dip lower, casting long shadows through the trees. My grandfather stopped again, looking around, and for the first time I saw fear in his eyes. He didn't say anything, just motioned for us to keep moving. He picked up the pace, and so did I. We walked for what felt like hours, but the cabin still seemed close, like no matter how far we went, it was right there, hidden behind the trees. Every now and then, I glanced back, and I swear I saw it, just beyond the shadows, like it was following us. My legs were aching, and panic was bubbling up inside me, but I kept pushing forward. I didn't want to believe that we couldn't escape. As night started to fall, we finally found a familiar part of the trail, the one leading back to my grandfather's house. I felt a wave of relief, but it was short-lived. My grandfather didn't slow down. He kept looking over his shoulder, walking faster and faster, like something was chasing us. We made it back to the house just as darkness fully swallowed the woods. My grandfather didn't say anything about what happened, but I could tell it had shaken him. He was usually so calm, but now he seemed on edge, like he knew something was out there. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. I couldn't stop thinking about the cabin. It felt like the forest had led us there on purpose, like it was playing some kind of twisted game. It had let us go, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. The next morning, I woke up early and looked out the window. The woods didn't look the same. The trees seemed darker, thicker, like they had moved closer to the house overnight. And even though I couldn't see it, I knew that the cabin was still out there, waiting. We never went back into the forest after that day. My grandfather didn't talk about it, and I didn't ask. But every time I visited him after that summer, I'd catch him standing at the window, staring out at the woods. He wasn't just looking at trees anymore. There was something else in those woods, something that had let us leave that day, but only because it wanted to. And I couldn't help but feel that one day we'd have to go back. Not by choice, but because the forest would call us again. And next time, I wasn't sure it would let us leave. Being a forest ranger isn't as thrilling as people imagine. It's mostly walking around, checking trails, and making sure campers don't break any rules. The job's quiet for the most part. The only real excitement comes from the rare lost hiker or spotting some wildlife. I've done this for years, so I thought I'd seen it all. One day, I was sent to patrol the far end of the forest. These were the less traveled trails, deep in the woods, away from the main campsites. It was really quiet out there, almost too quiet. Even the normal sounds, birds whined through the trees, were missing. It felt off, but I just figured it was the time of day or maybe the weather changing. About halfway through my patrol, I saw something weird. There was a path that wasn't marked on our maps. It didn't look like a regular trail, more like it had been made recently. The branches were broken, and the ground looked disturbed. I knew I should have turned around, but I couldn't help it. I wanted to know what was down there. Maybe some campers got lost and made this trail to find their way back. The farther I went, the stranger it got. The trees seemed thicker, their branches hanging low, blocking the sun. The ground felt softer, like it had been walked on not too long ago. It didn't feel like a normal trail anymore. Something about it was wrong, though I couldn't explain why. After walking for what seemed like an hour, I came to a small clearing. In the middle of it, there was an old cabin. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years, falling apart with age. But something wasn't right about it. There were no footprints, no signs of anyone being there recently, but the door was slightly open. As a ranger, I'm trained to check on abandoned structures, so I thought I'd just take a quick look and then report it later. As I got closer, I noticed something strange near the door. The ground was scattered with bones, small ones probably from animals. But they weren't just scattered randomly. They were in neat little piles, like someone had put them there on purpose. I felt a cold shiver run down my back. I didn't want to, but I knew I had to look inside. I pushed the door open slowly. The inside was dark, and the air felt thick, damp. It didn't smell like death, but something was off. Something sour, stale. I could barely see, but there was a table in the middle of the room, and on it were more bones. These were bigger, definitely not from animals. They looked human. I backed out of the cabin fast, my heart pounding. This place wasn't abandoned. Someone had been here recently, and they were collecting bones. I felt like something was watching me, even though I couldn't see anyone. That's when I heard it. A rustling in the trees behind me, then the sound of footsteps, slow but getting closer. I didn't stick around to see who it was. I ran as fast as I could, not caring if I stayed on the trail or not. The trees seemed to close in around me, branches grabbing at my clothes, the ground uneven, making me stumble. But I didn't stop, couldn't stop. When I finally made it back to the main trail, everything seemed normal again. The birds were singing, and the breeze felt cool on my face. But I knew that something was wrong back there, something I couldn't explain. I filed my report but didn't mention the cabin or the bones. I didn't want anyone else to find it. But sometimes on my night shifts, I still hear those footsteps, always just far enough away that I can't see who or what is making them. They never get close enough for me to catch a glimpse. But they're there, just out of sight, waiting for me to come back. And deep down, I know that if I ever do, I won't make it out again. It was one of those crisp fall evenings when the trees seemed to whisper secrets. I had been out walking my dog, Max, along the edge of the forest that runs next to my neighbor's property. Our houses are close together, but the forest acts as a natural barrier, keeping us separated from the thick woods beyond. As we walked deeper into the woods, Max suddenly stopped and his ears perked up. I could hear it too, a faint, steady thumping, like a heartbeat coming from the forest. I thought it might be an animal or just the wind playing tricks on us. But then Max started growling, a low, threatening sound I'd never heard from him before. We kept going, but my worry grew. The thumping grew louder and seemed to be getting closer. I decided it was time to head back, but as we turned, I noticed something strange. The path we usually took was gone, replaced by a tangle of branches and thick undergrowth. It was like the forest had changed while we were in it. I tried to retrace my steps, but the more we moved, the more lost I felt. The thumping was now a steady beat, echoing through the trees. Max was pulling at his leash, barking sharply and showing he was very agitated. I stumbled through the thick underbrush, my flashlight flickering and only showing dark shapes. Then I saw it, a dim light far away. It looked like someone was standing there, but they were too far to see clearly. My heart pounded. I knew it wasn't one of my neighbors. Everyone was at home, settling in for the night. Panic set in as I tried to move toward the light. The thumping became faster and more erratic, as if whatever was making it was coming straight for us. I could hear footsteps crunching behind me, but I was too scared to look back. Max was barking furiously, his instincts screaming danger. Finally, we broke through the dense brush into a clearing. The light turned out to be a lantern hanging from a tree, its light casting eerie shadows around. As I got closer, I saw an old, rusty barrel near the lantern. It looked like it had been there for ages, filled with old trash and broken pieces of wood. The thumping suddenly stopped. I realized it had been the sound of something dropping into the barrel, maybe a piece of metal or wood. It was a homemade alarm, set up by someone to scare off intruders or just to make noise. Whoever set it up was long gone, but their trap remained. Relieved but still shaken, I turned to leave the forest, guiding Max with a tight grip. As we reached the edge of the woods and stepped into the open, I saw my neighbor's house in the distance, its lights warm and comforting. But as I looked back at the dark forest, a cold chill ran down my spine. The thumping might have been a warning, but what if it wasn't meant for me? The forest was hiding something that used that noise to keep people away. And as I glanced back one last time, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was still watching, waiting for the next time someone dared to wander into its territory. The forest had changed for me forever, and now it felt like a place where unseen dangers lurked just beyond the trees. The forest was eerily quiet that evening. I had decided to go for a solo hike, needing some alone time after my recent divorce. The sky was gray and overcast, and the air felt thick, like it was holding its breath. The trail was familiar, but I had a strange feeling, like someone was watching me. I tried to ignore it, blaming it on the stress I'd been under. I kept going deeper into the woods, with only the sound of leaves rustling and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot for company. As I walked, the trail became harder to follow. The trees seemed to close in on me, and the thick canopy above blocked out most of the daylight. I pulled out my phone to check the map, but the screen was dim, almost as if it was failing on purpose. Then, I saw something that made my heart race. A torn piece of fabric caught on a low branch. It looked old and worn, but it was clearly part of a shirt or jacket. I took a deep breath and kept walking, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread. A few minutes later, I stumbled upon a small clearing. In the middle was a makeshift campsite, a few broken branches in a rough circle and an old half-buried cooler. My nerves were shot, but I knew I needed to get out of this creepy forest. I turned to head back, but the forest seemed to have changed. The familiar path was gone. The trees looked different, and the faint sound of rustling leaves seemed to follow me. I quickened my pace, feeling increasingly chased. Just as I began to panic, I saw a faint light through the trees. It was an old, weather-beaten cabin. I headed toward it, desperate to find some safety. As I got closer, I noticed something unsettling. The door was slightly open. I pushed the door open carefully and stepped inside. The cabin was empty, but my relief was short-lived. On the wall, someone had written in red, "Not alone." Suddenly, I heard a loud noise from outside, fast, heavy footsteps. My heart raced as I realized something or someone was out there. I slammed the door shut and barricaded it with an old table. I sat in the dark cabin, every creak and groan of the old building making my fear worse. Hours later, when the noise finally stopped, I dared to look outside. The forest was quiet again, but I still felt a sense of danger. I waited until dawn before making my way back to civilization. The cabin, the campsite, the torn fabric, they all felt like eerie reminders of how close I came to being lost forever in those woods. As I reached the edge of the forest, with the first light of morning, I was exhausted and terrified. The forest had its secrets, and I felt a chill knowing I had barely escaped whatever was lurking out there. It wasn't just the fear of being lost. It was the fear of knowing that whatever was in those woods might still be watching, waiting for its next chance. The shadows of that forest would always remind me of how close I came to becoming a part of its dark, hidden world. I had been on patrol for years, mostly driving around city streets and quiet neighborhoods. But that week, they assigned me to help the forest rangers. A hiker had gone missing, and they needed more people. I wasn't too excited about it, but orders were orders. The forest was thick, going on for miles. I parked my car at the edge, grabbed my stuff, and walked into the woods with a rough idea of where the hiker was last seen. The search team was spread out, each of us covering a different section. I was on my own, and at first I didn't mind. The trees were big and blocked most of the sunlight, which made everything cooler and quieter than I expected. I kept walking deeper, scanning the area with my flashlight as the sky started to get darker. After an hour, I realized something. It was too quiet. It wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet. This was the type that makes your skin crawl. No birds, no wind, just the sound of my own footsteps. I kept moving, telling myself it was just in my head. The forest was probably playing tricks on me. Then I found something. A shoe, half buried in the dirt, ripped at the heel. It looked old, worn out, like it had been here for a while. But it didn't look like it had been out in the woods long enough to be weathered. I picked it up, looked around, but there were no footprints, no path. It was just there. I walked further in and came across a campsite. What was left of it, anyway. A tent, torn up and collapsed. Stuff was scattered everywhere. I recognized some of the gear from the hikers' belongings, but it didn't make sense. It looked like someone had freaked out and left in a hurry. I figured maybe an animal came through and scared them, but there were no animal tracks, no signs of anything like that. No prints, no droppings, nothing. Something felt wrong, really wrong. I tried my radio, but it only gave me static. I messed with it a bit, but it was no use. The signal was dead. I stood there for a minute, uneasy, realizing how deep into the forest I had wandered without thinking. It was getting dark fast. I knew I should have turned back, but for some reason, I kept going. I don't know why. Maybe it was just curiosity or a bad feeling in my gut. Either way, I pressed on, feeling the tension build with every step. After what felt like hours, I came to a small clearing. That's when I saw it. There was a hole in the ground, like someone had dug something up but covered it again in a rush. The dirt looked uneven, disturbed. I crouched down, brushed some of the loose dirt away, and saw it. A hand. Human. My stomach twisted. I jumped back, feeling a cold sweat break out. I knew I had to leave, but I also knew I had to report this. I tried the radio again, still nothing. The only thing I could do was go back the way I came and get to my car as fast as possible. As I turned to leave, I heard something. Footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps far off in the distance. At first, I thought it was another officer, but something was off. The steps were too slow, too deliberate. I froze, listening. The footsteps stopped. But I knew someone, or something, was out there, watching me. I didn't wait to find out. I started walking quickly, trying to keep calm, but my heart was pounding in my chest. Every few steps, I felt like something was behind me, just out of sight. I didn't dare look back. I just kept moving, keeping my eyes forward, focused on getting out. But the forest seemed different now. The paths looked strange, the trees felt closer together. My flashlight flickered, and I could feel panic setting in. After what felt like forever, I finally saw my car through the trees. I didn't waste any time. I ran the last few steps, jumped into the car, and slammed the doors shut. I sat there for a moment, catching my breath, trying to make sense of what just happened. The forest was still quiet, but the air felt heavy, like something was waiting. I started the engine and pulled away. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the trees, just watching me. It was too far away to make out any details, but I could tell it wasn't an animal. I didn't stop. I didn't want to know who or what it was. I left that forest, but something stayed with me. I filed my report, told them about the campsite and the hand I found. But I didn't mention the figure. No one would believe me anyway. They never found the hiker, and I never went back to that forest. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that figure standing there, watching me. I wonder if it's still out there, waiting, and if one day someone else will wander in too far, and they won't be as lucky as I was to make it out. I was hiking in a forest I hadn't been to before. It was late September, and the air was cool. The leaves were just starting to turn yellow and orange. I planned a simple hike, just to clear my mind for a few hours. I wasn't looking for anything exciting, just some quiet. But quiet was the last thing I got. The trail was easy to follow at first, wide and well-marked. But after a couple of hours, it started to get smaller. I had the GPS on my phone, and I wasn't worried since I brought a power bank with me. The map showed a stream nearby, so I kept walking. But I never found the stream. The more I walked, the more the trail seemed to disappear. I soon realized I was surrounded by thick trees, and the sun was starting to go down. I could have turned back, but something about it made me feel like giving up would be the wrong move. So I kept going, even though I hadn't seen another person for hours. My phone still worked, but the GPS started acting strange. The map kept moving my location around, the little dot jumping from one place to another, sometimes completely off the trail. I thought I was heading back to where I parked, but after walking what felt like forever, I ended up in a part of the forest I didn't know. The trees were taller, older, and it was strangely quiet. No wind, no birds, just nothing. My phone lost its signal completely. I tried using the compass on it, but it just spun around in circles. That's when I saw it. Through the trees, maybe about 50 yards away, I spotted an old cabin. The wood was dark, rotting in places, and the roof was caving in. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years, but there was no way it was on the map. I didn't remember seeing any buildings marked. I told myself it could be an old ranger's cabin or maybe some kind of emergency shelter. But deep down, I knew it didn't make sense. Why would there be a cabin out here so far from any main trail? Still, with the sun going down, I figured it was better than nothing. I slowly walked toward it, trying to keep calm, even though everything inside me was screaming to get away. The door was slightly open. Inside, it was darker than it should have been, even though there was still some daylight left outside. I stepped in, and the smell hit me. Wet wood and something rotten. My stomach turned. There wasn't much inside. No furniture, nothing that showed anyone had lived there for a long time. Just an empty wooden floor and a fireplace filled with ash. But then, in the far corner, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. Fresh footprints. They were in the dust, leading to a back room. The door to that room was cracked open, just like the front door had been. I stood there, frozen, realizing someone had been in here. Recently, I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. My mind was racing, trying to figure out who could have left those prints, and why they were still here. What scared me the most was the silence. I didn't hear anything. No footsteps, no creaking floor, nothing. Slowly, I backed out of the cabin, trying not to make any noise. The air outside felt colder now, heavier. My heart was pounding, and every little sound around me felt louder. Leaves crunching under my boots, branches rustling above me. As I tried to find my way back, I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. The trees felt closer, like they were pressing in. I kept looking over my shoulder, but I never saw anything. At least I thought I didn't. The light was almost gone by now. I picked up my pace, trying to keep calm, but I couldn't help it. Panic was crawling up my spine. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I just wanted to get out of there. My phone still had no signal, and for some reason, the battery was draining way faster than it should have been. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a branch snap behind me. I stopped dead in my tracks. I didn't want to turn around. My breath caught in my throat, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I didn't want to know what made that noise. I didn't want to see what or who was following me. I started moving again, faster this time, still not looking back. My only thought was to get out of that forest. I finally saw the parking lot through the trees. I was exhausted. My legs felt like they were on fire, and my chest was tight, but I didn't stop. I ran the last part, barely making it to my car before I collapsed. I sat there for a while, catching my breath, before I dared to glance back at the forest. There was nothing there. No cabin. No one following me. Just the trees standing still and quiet. But something was wrong. The quiet wasn't normal. It was the same eerie silence from before. I didn't see anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still there, just out of sight, watching, waiting. I don't know what I walked into that day, and I don't care to find out. But there's one thing I do know for sure. I wasn't alone in those woods. And whatever it was, it didn't want me to leave. Something followed me out, and I think it's still out there, waiting for me to come back. It was a chilly, gray afternoon when I decided to take a walk through the forest behind my house. My neighbor, Tim, had once mentioned a trail that went deep into the woods, one that wasn't marked on any map. Tim had always been a little odd, kept to himself, didn't say much, but I figured he knew these woods better than anyone else. I'd seen him walk into them plenty of times, always by himself. I started walking through the trees, following what looked like a faint trail. The farther I went, the quieter it got. The usual sounds of birds and the wind rustling the leaves were gone, replaced by an eerie silence. I told myself it was just because I was farther away from the road, but it still felt strange. The air was getting colder, the trees were growing closer together, and the light above was starting to fade as the clouds thickened. After what felt like forever, I stumbled across something odd. There was a small clearing, and in the middle was a fire pit, long burned out. Around it were logs set in a circle like people had sat there recently. I felt a bit uneasy, but I brushed it off, thinking maybe other hikers or Tim had been here before. But then, something else caught my eye. A big pile of sticks and branches, stacked into a rough shelter at the edge of the clearing. I stood there, staring at it. It didn't look like the kind of shelter someone would make for camping. It was messy, poorly built, and didn't even have a door. It seemed more like a place someone would hide in. I walked closer to take a look inside. At first, I thought it was empty, but then I noticed something strange. Buried halfway under the leaves and dirt was a shoe. A man's boot, old and covered in mud, but still in good shape. It didn't seem like something someone would just leave behind. Suddenly, I got this awful feeling, like I was being watched. My skin crawled, and I quickly spun around, scanning the trees. No one was there, but that feeling didn't go away. My gut was telling me to leave, but I stood there, stuck, staring at the boot and the quiet clearing around me. Something was off, and it wasn't just the shoe. It was everything. It felt wrong, like I had wandered into a place I wasn't supposed to be. I slowly backed away, keeping my eyes on the forest, and hurried back to where I thought the path was. But the farther I walked, the more I realized I didn't know where I was. The trees all looked the same, and the trail seemed to vanish into the underbrush. I started walking faster, hoping I'd find something familiar soon. Then, off in the distance, I saw someone moving through the trees. My first thought was Tim. Maybe he was out here checking his traps or doing whatever it was he did in the woods. I started following him, moving quickly toward where I saw him disappear. But every time I got closer, the figure slipped deeper into the forest, just out of sight. I kept chasing after him, but something didn't feel right. He never turned around, never slowed down, like he didn't hear me at all. It almost felt like he was leading me deeper into the woods on purpose. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows through the trees. I finally stopped, breathing hard, and realized I had no idea where I was. The figure was gone. I was alone, lost, and the temperature was dropping fast. My chest tightened with panic as I spun around, trying to retrace my steps. But there were no signs, no trail to follow. The trees were thick, and the silence was overwhelming. Then I saw it again, the shelter. The same one from earlier with the fire pit and the logs in a circle. Somehow, even though I hadn't been walking in circles, I ended up back there. My heart pounded as I realized I wasn't just lost. Something was wrong. Something was leading me back to this place. I forced myself to walk past the clearing, not looking back at the shelter. My feet stumbled over roots and rocks as I pushed through the trees, desperate to find my way out. Every sound made me jump, but I kept going. After what felt like hours, I finally saw the edge of the forest and my house beyond it. As I stepped out of the woods, I glanced back one last time. Standing just inside the tree line at the edge of the clearing was Tim. He wasn't moving, just standing there watching me. His face was blank, but his eyes were cold, like he had been waiting for me to leave. It wasn't relief I felt. It was something far worse. I never went back into those woods after that. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about Tim. Every now and then, I'd catch him watching me from his yard, his gaze lingering just a little too long. But it wasn't just his stare that bothered me. It was what I saw the next day. I was walking past his house when I noticed something leaning against his front porch. It was the same boot I'd found in the shelter, cleaned up, polished even, and beside it another pair. I stopped walking, staring at them for a moment, then hurried home. I locked my doors that night and kept the curtains closed. Whatever Tim was doing out in those woods, I didn't want to know. But now, every time I hear a twig snap in the woods behind my house, I wonder if he's still out there, and if he's waiting for me to follow him again. I've always liked hiking by myself. There's something about being out there, just me and the quiet of the forest. No traffic, no people, just the sound of the wind and the trees. So, when I got a long weekend off work, I decided to head to a forest about 2 hours away. I'd been there before, but I wanted to try a trail that went further into the woods. It wasn't on most maps, but I'd read about it online, and I figured it would be nice to explore. The first few hours were calm. Birds were chirping, leaves rustling under my boots, and the trail was easy to follow. I kept walking, feeling more relaxed the deeper I went. I hadn't seen anyone all day, but that didn't bother me. I liked being alone out there. By the afternoon, I found a small clearing with a stream running through it. I sat on a big rock near the water, had a snack, and just listened. The forest was so still. I could hear every drop of water hitting the rocks in the stream. It was peaceful, almost too quiet, but I didn't think much of it at the time. After resting for a bit, I got back on the trail. But as I walked, something felt off. The air felt heavier, like something was out there with me. I shook it off, telling myself it was just nerves from being alone. But that feeling didn't go away. The further I went, the thicker the trees got. The path started getting harder to see, covered with leaves and branches. I started looking for the markers other hikers had left. Pieces of cloth tied to trees or little marks cut into the bark. After a while, I realized I hadn't seen any of those markers for a long time. I stopped and looked around, but everything looked the same, just trees in every direction. It hit me then, I was lost. I turned around, trying to backtrack, but nothing looked familiar. Every tree, every twist in the path felt like I'd already seen it. I pulled out my map, but the trail I was on wasn't even on it. I checked my phone, no signal. That's when the panic started to creep in. I hadn't seen another person all day, and I wasn't sure anyone knew I had taken this trail. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows through the trees. The light turned orange, making the forest look strange and twisted. I started walking faster, trying to stay calm, but every few minutes, I thought I heard something behind me. A branch snapping, leaves crunching. I'd stop and listen, but it would be quiet again, like nothing was there. The sky kept getting darker, and the forest felt more and more threatening. Every sound seemed louder, and every shadow felt like it was moving. I walked even faster, then started to jog, hoping I'd find my way out soon. That's when I saw it, a cabin. It wasn't on the map, but there it was, hidden among the trees, old and worn down. The windows were dark, and the door was cracked open. For a moment I felt relieved. Maybe I could stay there until morning, or maybe there would be something inside to help me find my way back. But as I got closer, that heavy feeling came back. The air around the cabin felt wrong. It looked like no one had been there for years, but the door was slightly open, like someone had just been there. I stood there for a moment, deciding if I should go in. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It didn't feel right, but it was getting dark, and I didn't have many options. Just as I was about to step closer, I saw something move in the trees behind the cabin. At first, I thought it was an animal, but it was too fast. My heart started pounding. I backed away from the cabin, scanning the trees, trying to see what was out there. Then I saw it again. This time it was closer. A figure, human-shaped but too quick, moving between the trees like it was watching me. It wasn't coming toward me, but it was circling, like it was waiting for something. I didn't wait to find out what. I turned and ran, pushing myself harder than I ever had before. The darkness made it hard to see, but I didn't care. My breathing was loud and heavy, but I just kept running, trying to get away from whatever was out there. I don't know how long I ran, but after what felt like hours, I stumbled onto the main trail. I recognized the signs, the familiar markers. I felt a wave of relief, but I didn't stop. I kept going, not daring to look back. By the time I reached the clearing near the parking lot, it was well after midnight. I collapsed there, breathing hard, my legs burning, but too scared to look back into the trees. Whatever was out there, it had followed me for miles. I could feel it. I didn't camp that night. I walked straight to my car and drove off. I didn't tell anyone what happened, and I've never gone back. But sometimes late at night I think about it, about how I never heard it behind me, even when I knew it was there, about how fast it moved, too fast to be human. Whatever was out there wasn't meant to be seen. It was something that belonged deep in the forest, far away from people. And now, when I close my eyes, I see it sometimes, still watching me. It never really left. My stepbrother and I were hiking deep into the forest. He's always been the outdoorsy type, always making me go with him on these trips. This time, he talked me into going farther than we ever had, into a part of the woods we hadn't been to before. The trees were thick, and the more we walked, the more it felt like we were really cut off. There were no sounds from the road, no distant noises from cars or anything. Just quiet, with the occasional rustling of leaves from animals we couldn't see. We followed a narrow path that looked like no one had used it in years. The air felt colder the deeper we went, and the sunlight barely made it through the trees above us. At first, it didn't bother me. I figured my stepbrother knew where he was going. He always acted like he did, and I just went along with it. After a while, though, something started to feel wrong. I couldn't quite figure out what it was at first, but the forest started feeling different. It was too quiet now. No barges, no wind, no rustling. Just the sound of our footsteps crunching on the leaves. We kept going, even though the path seemed to vanish. My stepbrother kept looking back at me, like he was checking if I was okay, but he didn't say anything. Eventually, I started feeling uneasy. Every direction looked the same. The trees were all identical, and there were no landmarks, no way of knowing if we were still on the right track or not. At some point, my stepbrother stopped. He pointed ahead, but all I saw were more trees. Then I noticed something on the ground. The dirt looked like it had been dug up recently. There was a small hole partly covered by leaves. It wasn't very big, maybe the size of a dog, but something about it made my stomach turn. It looked fresh, too fresh to have been there long. My stepbrother didn't say anything, but I could tell he was weirded out too. We both knew this wasn't normal. Without saying a word, we decided to turn around and head back. But as we did, the air felt different, felt heavier, like it was harder to breathe. I started feeling like someone was nearby, watching us. It wasn't just in my head. Felt real. We started walking faster, not saying a word. The path on the way back didn't look the same. It was like the trees had moved, or maybe we were just more lost than we realized. My chest was tight, and I could feel my heart pounding, but we didn't stop. The feeling of being watched didn't go away. It was like something was just behind us, keeping pace. After what felt like forever, we finally saw the edge of the forest. I felt a bit of relief, but just as we were about to step out, I heard it, a twig snapping behind us. I didn't want to look, but I knew my stepbrother heard it too because he broke into a run. I followed right behind him, too scared to turn around and see what it was. We made it to the car, both of us gasping for air. I jumped inside and slammed the door shut, my heart racing. As we sat there, trying to catch our breath, I glanced back at the trees. For a split second, I thought I saw something move in the shadows. There was a shape standing just behind the tree line, watching us. I blinked, and it was gone. We didn't talk about it on the way home. Neither of us wanted to admit something was wrong, but we both knew we had come across something we shouldn't have. Something that shouldn't have been out there. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to shake off the feeling that something was wrong. Every little sound outside made me jump. Then, just as I was about to drift off, I heard something outside my window, a soft, steady tapping, like fingers lightly drumming on the glass. I didn't look, but I knew, deep down, that whatever had been in those woods had followed us home. It had found me, and it wasn't going away. I set out for a hike in the old forest, a place I'd heard about since I was a kid. The trees were so thick that they blocked out most of the sunlight, casting long, twisted shadows on the ground. I knew the trail, but it had been a while since I'd last walked it. The forest was eerily quiet, almost too quiet. I moved on, with only the crunch of leaves and sticks underfoot breaking the silence. The trees seemed to lean in, as if they were whispering about me. I tried to shake off the weird feeling, thinking it was just the dense, old forest playing tricks on me. But the deeper I went, the heavier the forest felt, pressing in on me. Around noon, I found a small clearing with an old, falling-apart cabin. It looked abandoned and beaten down, with ivy climbing up its sides and a drooping roof. It was a creepy sight, but I was curious, so I went closer. The door creaked open with a push, revealing a dark, musty inside. I peeked in but decided not to go further. I kept going, noticing how the forest seemed to get darker, with shadows stretching out in odd ways. When I started heading back, the trail didn't seem as familiar. I looked around and realized the forest was no longer a place I recognized. The path was twisted, and the trees seemed to have moved, hiding the landmarks I knew. Panic started to creep in. I picked up my pace, trying to retrace my steps. My heart raced as I stumbled through the thick underbrush, completely lost. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump. The forest felt alive, but not in a comforting way. The air grew colder, and I had the unsettling feeling of being watched. I struggled to stay calm, knowing I needed to if I wanted to get out. As twilight began to settle, I saw a faint light through the trees. I pushed through the dense undergrowth and stumbled onto a part of the trail I recognized. I followed it quickly and finally reached the edge of the forest just as it got dark. I was relieved to see the open field and my car parked on the roadside. I glanced back at the forest, now just a dark shape in the distance. My experience had left me rattled, but I was out. The forest's secrets were still hidden, but one thing was clear. It was not a place to mess around with. The way back had been tougher to find than I expected, and the forest seemed almost to have a will of its own, trying to keep me inside. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me the entire time, something that didn't want me to leave. The trees had seemed to close in as I left, and the shadows seemed to move just a bit too quickly. It was like the forest had been holding its breath, waiting for me to wander too far. I knew I would never return to that place again, but the sense of being followed stayed with me long after I was safely home. I was hiking alone in the thick forests of the Black Forest in Germany, far off the beaten path. The tall, old trees created a dense cover overhead, letting only small patches of sunlight through. I'd come to escape the busy tourist spots and enjoy some quiet time. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. The usual sounds of the forest, birds and rustling leaves, slowly disappeared until all I could hear was the crunch of my boots on the forest floor. I stopped to take a drink from my water bottle when I saw something strange. A small clearing, once hidden by bushes, was now visible. It looked like someone had recently cleared the area. Feeling curious, I walked into the clearing. It looked too neat, almost unnervingly so. In the middle was a large, shallow pit, surrounded by disturbed soil and broken branches. My gut told me to leave, but I felt drawn to investigate the pit. As I crouched near it, I saw several pieces of old, stained cloth scattered around. A chill went down my spine, not from the cold but from the realization that this pit seemed like it was used to hide or bury something or someone. I stood up quickly, feeling a heavy weight of unease. The forest now felt stifling, and the silence around me felt unnervingly loud. I turned to leave, but my heart raced when I heard a faint rustling sound behind me. I spun around, but the clearing was empty. Panic set in. I started walking fast, then broke into a run. The feeling of being watched, of something following me, grew stronger with every step. The forest seemed to close in, and the sunlight that peeked through the trees felt faint and distant. Eventually, I broke out of the thick underbrush and saw the trailhead in the distance. I ran the last stretch, not stopping until I was safely back in the parking lot. I didn't look back. When I got home, I checked the news and saw reports about several people who had gone missing in that forest over the past few months, with no leads on their whereabouts. The thought of what I'd found in that clearing, coupled with those reports, was unsettling. That day, the Black Forest showed me its dark side. The eerie silence and the feeling of being followed lingered. It made me realize that sometimes there are parts of our world that are best left unexplored, and sometimes the things we stumble upon are better left unknown. I didn't want to go, but my wife insisted. Her mom had invited us to stay at a cabin in the woods for the weekend. The idea of being stuck with my mother-in-law in the middle of nowhere for days didn't sound fun, but I couldn't say no without causing problems at home. So we packed up the car and headed out. The cabin was old, creaky, and far away from anything else, surrounded by thick trees. The kind of place where the quiet is so heavy it makes you nervous. My wife seemed excited, but from the moment we arrived, I felt uneasy. There was something strange about the place. The first night seemed fine. We had dinner, talked a bit, and went to bed, but I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing noises outside, branches snapping, leaves rustling, just enough to keep me on edge. I told myself it was probably just animals, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next day, my wife and mother-in-law decided to go for a hike. I chose to stay back, needing some space. I watched them walk into the trees, the forest quickly hiding them from view. Hours went by, and I started feeling restless. I decided to take a short walk around the cabin to clear my head. As I walked, I noticed something odd, marks on the trees, like deep scratches. They didn't look like they were made by an animal. They looked intentional. My mind started racing, trying to figure out what they were. I quickly went back to the cabin, feeling more and more uneasy. The sun started to go down, and my wife and mother-in-law still weren't back. I stood on the porch, looking at the trees, that same strange feeling growing inside me. When they finally came out of the forest, I felt a bit of relief. But there was something different about my mother-in-law. She seemed off. Her face was pale, her movements stiff, and she didn't say a word. That night, the noises outside got louder. Something was moving through the trees, getting closer. My wife was fast asleep, but I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening. My mother-in-law's room was down the hall, and every once in a while, I thought I could hear her moving around. But the way she moved didn't sound right. I finally fell asleep, but not for long. I was jolted awake by a loud thud coming from her room. I froze, my heart racing. The thud was followed by a dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was really wrong. Morning came and the cabin was silent. My mother-in-law was gone. Her bed was untouched, but her things were still in the room. My wife was worried, but I had this cold feeling inside me. I knew she wasn't coming back. We searched the woods, calling her name, but we didn't find anything. Just those strange marks on the trees, more of them now, leading deeper into the forest. As night came, we had no choice but to go back to the cabin. The air was heavy with a strange quiet, like the forest was waiting for something. That night, the noises came back, louder than ever. Scratches on the walls, thuds on the roof, the old wood creaking like something heavy was moving around outside. My wife tried to stay calm, but I could see the fear in her eyes. I knew she felt it too. Whatever was out there, it wasn't an animal. The next morning, we packed up and left as fast as we could. We never talked about what happened at the cabin, not even to each other. But I can't stop thinking about those scratches on the trees and the way my mother-in-law's face changed in the woods. We never found out what happened to her. The forest took her, leaving us with nothing but questions. Sometimes, I think back to those marks on the trees, leading deeper into the woods, where something waits, watching just out of sight. And I can't help but wonder, what if it's still out there, waiting for someone else to come too close? I had always loved visiting my grandmother's cabin in the woods. It was our escape from the busy and noisy world. The forest around the cabin was thick and quiet, with only the sounds of nature breaking the silence. But this time something felt off. I arrived late in the afternoon. The sun was already setting behind the trees, making long shadows that made the forest look even denser and darker. Grandma was not feeling well, so she was resting inside while I unpacked and got dinner ready. While I was gathering wood for the fireplace, I noticed something strange. There were a few small piles of dirt scattered around the base of the trees. It looked like something had been digging, but there were no tracks or clues about what it might have been. I thought it was just a small animal and went back to my work. That night, the forest felt unusually still. I was sitting by the fireplace, trying to ignore a growing sense of unease. I thought about going to bed early, but instead, I decided to take a short walk around the cabin to clear my mind. The moon was bright, casting an eerie light on the forest. The trees looked closer than usual, with their branches twisting into odd shapes. As I walked, I heard a faint rustling behind me. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there, just shadows playing tricks with the light. I hurried back to the cabin, eager to get back to the safety of the warm fire. Just as I reached the back porch, I saw a large, freshly dug hole not far from the cabin. It was deep, and the dirt around it was all messed up. My heart pounded as I realized this wasn't the work of any small animal. The hole was too big and too precise. Inside the cabin, I locked all the doors and checked the windows, trying to push away the growing fear. I kept hearing faint noises from outside, scratching and shuffling, like someone was trying to get in. I told myself it was just the wind or animals, but the noises kept coming. Around midnight, I decided to call the police. They came quickly and searched the area. The lead officer told me that a local man had recently gone missing and that the disturbance in the forest looked like someone had been trying to hide something. The next morning, the police found that the hole was part of a shallow grave. It seemed that someone had been digging it recently. They never found the missing man, but the discovery made it clear that whoever had been in those woods recently had dangerous intentions. I stayed with Grandma for a few more days, but the cabin felt different. The once peaceful forest now felt like a place full of hidden threats. Every shadow and every rustle in the dark was a reminder of the terrifying reality I had discovered. As I left the cabin for the last time, I looked back at the dark woods. The forest was as still as ever, but I knew something far more frightening was lurking there. The quiet was no longer comforting. It was ominous. The hole was still there, and as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was still watching from the shadows, waiting for the next chance to strike. The woods held a dark secret, and I'd only caught a glimpse of its true nature. I wasn't sure why I agreed to go hiking with my neighbor, Tom, and his friend, Dave. They seemed nice enough, always waving when I saw them outside, but we had never really hung out before. One day, Tom mentioned a forest a little outside of town that he liked to visit. He said it was a hidden spot, not many people knew about it, and we'd have the place to ourselves. Spending a Saturday hiking didn't sound bad, so I agreed to go along. We met up early in the morning, packed our stuff, and drove out to the forest. The place was more out of the way than I expected. The trees were tall and thick, and the trails weren't easy to see. Tom and Dave seemed to know where they were going, so I didn't think much of it. We walked for what felt like hours. The sound of leaves crunching under our boots was the only thing breaking the silence. The air was cool, but as we went deeper into the forest, it started to feel colder. After a while, we reached a small open area in the woods. It was strangely quiet, like the whole forest had stopped making noise. Tom suggested we take a break, so I dropped my backpack and sat on a fallen tree. There was this weird feeling creeping up my back, but I tried to shake it off. Dave wandered off, saying he needed to check something out. Tom didn't seem to care, so I stayed where I was, trying to ignore the bad feeling in my gut. As time passed, I noticed Tom looking around more than before. He wasn't as relaxed anymore. He seemed on edge, and that started to make me nervous. I asked if everything was okay, but he just nodded and said we should wait for Dave to come back. Minutes turned into an hour, and there was still no sign of Dave. The silence felt heavier, like the forest was closing in around us. Eventually, Tom stood up and said we should go look for him. I didn't want to stay there any longer, so I agreed. We followed the path Dave had taken, but the deeper we went into the woods, the stranger it felt. The trees seemed closer together. The light barely got through. My heart was beating faster with each step. After some time, we found Dave, or what was left of him. He was slumped against a tree, his eyes wide open, staring blankly. There were no cuts or bruises, no signs of a fight, but he was clearly dead. My mind went blank, trying to understand what I was seeing. Tom just stood there, not saying a word, his face pale. Fear hit me hard, not just because Dave was dead, but because I realized Tom had led me here. I didn't really know these people. I didn't know what they were capable of. The friendly neighbor act felt like a lie now. I looked at Tom, and his face was emotionless, cold. I took a step back, then another, before I turned and ran. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get away from them, away from that forest. I could hear Tom's footsteps behind me, but I didn't dare look back. My lungs burned. My legs felt like they would give out, but fear pushed me to keep running. I don't know how long I ran before I finally stumbled out of the forest and onto the road. I fell to the ground, gasping for air, looking around to make sure Tom wasn't behind me. The road was empty. The forest was quiet. I had made it out, but I knew I couldn't go back. Not to that forest, and not to my home where Tom still lived next door. I never found out what really happened to Dave, and I never wanted to know. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just an accident. Whatever it was, Tom knew more than he was letting on. I moved out of the neighborhood a week later, leaving no forwarding address, no trace of where I'd gone. A month after I moved, I read about another missing person in the same forest. The article didn't give many details, just that someone had gone hiking and never came back. The name wasn't familiar, but the location was. I never wanted to think about that place again, but now I can't help but wonder how many others had taken a hike with Tom, only to disappear into that forest, never to be seen again. I knew one thing for sure. I got out just in time, and I wouldn't be the last. In the summer of 1998, I decided to hike through a remote forest in northern Michigan. I wanted to get away from the chaos of everyday life and reconnect with nature. I packed just the basics, a map, a compass, and a few other essentials, and set out early in the morning, hoping to cover about 15 miles by sunset. The forest was thick and quiet, with only the occasional rustling of leaves and distant bird calls. About 10 miles in, I noticed something strange. A path that wasn't on my map appeared, winding off deeper into the woods. My curiosity got the best of me, and I decided to follow it, thinking it might lead to a nice viewpoint or a stream. The further I went, the narrower the path became, until it was barely visible. The sunlight barely reached through the dense trees, making the forest feel dark and oppressive. I kept going, my footsteps muffled by the thick layer of fallen leaves. Hours passed, and the sky started to darken. I checked my map and compass, but they seemed unreliable. I tried to retrace my steps, but the forest had changed. What once felt familiar now seemed strange. I felt a growing sense of panic as I realized I was lost. I tried to stay calm, but fear was setting in. As night fell, I heard something moving through the underbrush behind me. It wasn't the usual forest sounds. This was deliberate and rhythmic. Quickened my pace, hoping to find a way out. The sound followed me, never too close, but always just enough to keep me on edge. I stumbled into a small clearing and saw a cabin, an old rundown place. I was relieved to find some shelter, even if it looked abandoned. I approached carefully and found the door slightly open. Inside, the cabin was empty except for a dusty table and some old furniture. I locked the door behind me, feeling a bit safer. As I tried to settle in for the night, I heard a loud crash outside. I peered through a crack in the wall and saw a figure moving around the cabin. It was too dark to see clearly, but it was definitely a person, and they were trying to get inside. Fear overwhelmed me. I couldn't stay there. I waited until the figure moved away and then bolted into the night. I knew the forest was vast, but I had to find my way back. I used my compass and followed a general direction I hoped would lead me out. The night was endless and exhausting, but as dawn broke, I finally found a trail I recognized. I was drained and terrified as I made my way to the nearest ranger station. When I told the rangers what happened, they were concerned. They told me that the area I had wandered into had occasional reports of people running into others who were not so friendly, often those living off the grid who could be dangerous. I never found out who or what I had encountered that night, but the experience left me with a chilling realization. Sometimes, the darkest places in the forest aren't the trees or the shadows, but the people who choose to hide there. And as I left that forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for the next curious soul to wander too far. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend, a chance for my second wife and me to fix things between us. We'd been going through some tough times, and getting away from everything seemed like the perfect way to clear our heads. The forest had always helped me calm down, and I hoped it would do the same for her. We found a quiet spot far from any trails, set up our camp, and spent the day walking through the thick woods. The air was cool, and the smell of pine was strong. For the first time in a while, I felt like I could breathe again. As night came, we settled by the fire, the flames softly crackling as they flickered. We were far from everything, just us and the forest. No distractions, no worries, at least that's what I thought. I woke up in the middle of the night, and the fire had burned out. The tent felt stuffy, and the air outside was thick. I thought it was just the humidity, the kind that makes everything feel damp and close. But when I looked over at her side of the tent, she wasn't there. At first, I wasn't too worried. Maybe she had gone to the edge of the camp, needing some time alone. But as I sat there, waiting, minutes passing by, a bad feeling started to creep in. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside, calling her name softly into the darkness. All I heard back was the sound of leaves rustling in the wind. I walked toward where we'd hiked earlier, thinking she might have wandered off. The flashlight cut through the darkness, but every shadow seemed to stretch and move, like the forest was playing tricks on me. The trees stood tall and silent, almost like they were hiding something. After what felt like hours, I saw something on the ground. It was a piece of cloth caught on a low branch, her jacket. The fabric was torn, like it had snagged on something sharp. My heart sank. Something was wrong, very wrong. I started moving faster, my breathing getting harder. The trees seemed to close in around me, the path disappearing as I went deeper into the woods. Then I saw it. A small open space up ahead, dimly lit by the moon. When I stepped into the clearing, the first thing I saw was her. She was lying on the ground, her body twisted in a way that didn't look right. I froze, my mind refusing to accept what I was seeing. This wasn't an accident. The way she was lying, the marks on the ground. It was clear she had tried to run, tried to fight, but something had caught up with her. Panic hit me, making it hard to breathe. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. But deep down, I knew. The quiet forest, the torn fabric, the struggle in the dirt. This wasn't some wild animal attack. Someone had been out here with us, watching us, waiting. I stood there, unable to move, as the realization sank in. Whoever did this could still be out there, hiding in the shadows. The thought of being hunted, just like she had been, sent a cold shiver through me. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually, fear pushed me to move. I ran back through the trees, not caring about the noise I made. The flashlight shook in my hand, the beam bouncing around as I stumbled over roots and rocks. When I finally reached the campsite, I grabbed whatever I could and left everything else behind. I drove back through the forest, the headlights cutting through the darkness, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching me leave. I didn't stop until I was back on the main road, miles away from those woods. Even now, I can't get the image of her out of my mind, the way she looked in that clearing, so far from help, so far from safety. The police called it a freak accident, maybe an animal attack, but I know better. There was nothing random about it. Someone had been out there with us, and they had been waiting for the right moment. And what haunts me the most is the thought that whoever did this might still be out there, hidden in the woods, waiting for their next chance. Maybe next time, it'll be someone else who thinks they're just going for a peaceful weekend in the forest. Someone else who doesn't realize until it's too late that they're not alone. My brother and I decided to hike deep into the forest one weekend. We were used to being outside, but this time we wanted to push ourselves by exploring a part of the woods we had never been to before. The trees were thick, blocking out most of the sunlight and making the place feel heavy. But we were excited, eager to see what was beyond the trails we knew. As we went deeper, the forest grew quieter. There were no birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of our footsteps crunching on the dry twigs and leaves beneath us. The silence wasn't comforting. It felt off, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. We kept moving, even though my stomach felt uneasy with each step. My brother was ahead, his back to me as we followed a narrow path that seemed to twist endlessly through the trees. I noticed something strange. The further we walked, the less familiar the forest looked. The trees seemed twisted, their branches stretching out like crooked fingers, and the path we were on started to disappear into the thick bushes. After a while, I realized we were lost. Panic set in when I saw the look on my brother's face as he turned around, his eyes scanning for anything recognizable. But there was nothing, just the same twisted trees and the heavy silence. We kept walking, hoping to find our way back, but the forest seemed to close in on us. The path completely vanished, and we were pushing through thick underbrush, thorns scratching at our arms and legs. It felt like the forest was trying to keep us there, trapping us. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest grew darker and more menacing. We had no choice but to keep moving, but every direction looked the same. It was as if the forest was shifting around us, making us confused and lost. Then, out of nowhere, we came across an old, overgrown trail. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, but it was our only hope. We followed it, the darkening forest closing in on us from all sides. I could feel my heart pounding, fear gripping me as the shadows grew longer. As we walked, the trees started to look normal again, less twisted. The path widened, and for a moment I thought we might actually find our way out. But then, I realized why the forest had suddenly changed. Ahead of us, just off the path, was a clearing. In the center of the clearing was a small, run-down cabin. It looked abandoned, with rotting wood and a sagging roof. But what really caught my attention was the door. It was wide open, as if someone had just stepped inside. We stood there, staring at the cabin, not knowing what to do. The forest was silent again, like it was waiting for us to make a move. The cabin seemed out of place, like it didn't belong in the middle of this dense, suffocating forest. Something about it felt wrong, but we were tired, lost, and had no other options. We didn't go inside. Something inside me told me not to. Instead, we kept walking, hoping to find another way out. As we left the clearing, I couldn't shake the feeling that the cabin was watching us, waiting for us to return. When we finally made it back to a familiar trail and out of the forest as night fully set in, we were relieved. But the image of that cabin stayed with me. Later, when I tried to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were not alone that night. I could almost hear the distant echo of footsteps following us, always just out of sight, as if something or someone had been there watching us all along. The cabin's door stayed open in my mind, a silent invitation to something dark and unknown that we narrowly escaped. I know for sure, some places are meant to be avoided, and some things are best left undiscovered. I decided to go on a solo hike deep into the forest, away from the busy trails. It was a warm summer afternoon, and the sunlight was shining through the trees, creating long shadows on the ground. The forest was quiet, almost too quiet, with only the occasional sound of leaves rustling and a bird's distant call breaking the silence. I followed a narrow, overgrown path that seemed like it hadn't been used in a long time. The deeper I went, the thicker the trees got, their branches twisting together above me, blocking out more and more of the light. The air grew cooler, and I started to feel uneasy, but I pushed the feeling away, determined to enjoy the peace. After what felt like hours, I realized I hadn't seen a single sign of another person. The path had almost completely disappeared, and I found myself stepping over fallen branches and pushing through thick bushes. The light was fading faster than I expected, and the forest was now filled with shadows that seemed to move and shift as I walked. I stopped to check my phone, hoping to use the GPS to find my way back, but there was no signal. The battery was also almost dead. I cursed under my breath and tried to retrace my steps, but everything looked the same. The trees were thick and strange, and I quickly realized I was lost. As I walked, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I told myself it was just my nerves, that I was alone out here, but every time I stopped, I could hear faint sounds behind me. Twigs snapping, leaves crunching. I started walking faster, but the sounds seemed to follow, always just out of sight. The sun was nearly set, and the forest was now a maze of darkness. I felt panic rising in my chest. I had no flashlight, no way to see where I was going. My heart pounded as I stumbled through the bushes, trying to find any landmark that looked familiar, but it was hopeless. I was completely turned around. Then I saw it. A small clearing up ahead, the last bit of daylight shining on it. I hurried towards it, hoping to get a better view of where I was, but when I reached the edge of the clearing, I froze. In the center was a small, run-down cabin. It looked old, the wood rotting and the roof caved in on one side. The sight of it filled me with fear, but at the same time, I felt strangely drawn to it. Maybe someone had lived there once. Maybe they left something behind that could help me find my way out. I approached the cabin carefully, the sounds of the forest fading into a heavy silence. The door was hanging off its hinges, and I pushed it open with a loud creak. Inside, the air was musty, and the floor was covered in dirt and old leaves. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper that was peeling away in long strips. I searched the cabin, looking for anything useful, a map, a flashlight, anything. But there was nothing, just empty, crumbling rooms that felt like they hadn't been touched in years. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. A small, dusty book lying on a table in the corner. I picked it up and flipped through the pages. The book was a journal, filled with entries written in shaky handwriting. The first few pages were simple, describing the daily life of someone living in the cabin. But as I read further, the entries became more frantic, more confused. The writer talked about something in the woods, something that watched them, followed them, drove them crazy. My hands shook as I read the last entry, the words barely readable. I can't get away. It's in the trees. It's in the shadows. I thought I was alone, but it's always been here, waiting. I dropped the journal and ran out of the cabin, my heart racing. The forest was now pitch black, and the sounds had returned, louder and closer than before. I ran without thinking, crashing through the bushes, desperate to put as much distance between me and that cabin as possible. But no matter how far I ran, the feeling of being watched never went away. The sounds followed me, getting louder, until I could almost feel something right behind me. I didn't stop, didn't look back, just kept running, praying I would find my way out of this nightmare. Finally, after what felt like hours, I burst out of the forest and onto a road. I was exhausted, My clothes were torn, my body covered in scratches, but I didn't care. I was out. I was safe. But as I stood there, catching my breath, I realized something. The road was empty, and there were no sounds of cars, no lights in the distance, just more trees stretching out on either side, and the dark forest behind me. I hadn't escaped. I was still trapped, surrounded by the same trees, the same shadows. And whatever was in the forest, it was still out there, watching, waiting for me to come back. The road felt more like a trap than a way out. And as I stood there, I knew deep down that no matter where I went, I'd never really be free of those trees. They would always be waiting, just out of sight, ready to pull me back in. And when they did, I wouldn't be getting out again. In 2017, my fiancé, now my husband, and I decided to go camping in eastern Pennsylvania. The place we picked for the night was very basic. Camping was free, there was no cell service, and the road was barely passable. We did come across 2 other people. They might not be connected to what happened later, but they were strange enough that I'll mention them. The first person was a woman with her truck parked slightly off the road as we drove by. The hood was up, and she seemed to be waiting for someone to stop and help. Normally, my fiancé would have no problem stopping, but this time, something about her made him uneasy. She didn't look like she really needed help, and usually people who need help look hopeful when you approach. But she just seemed to expect we'd stop. At least that's what my fiancé thought. I didn't notice anything particularly odd about her. The second person appeared after we had chosen a spot and were setting up a fire for dinner. I had seen a car drive by a few times, but my fiancé pointed out that it was the same car each time, and the man inside seemed to be watching us. This made my fiancé a bit uncomfortable, but we had driven around for a while before finding a spot we liked. The ground was muddy from recent rain, and we wanted the driest spot possible. The man in the car could have been doing the same thing. We briefly considered moving, but the road was so muddy that if he wanted to find us, he could easily follow our tracks. There were some other tracks, but not many. He'd only have to backtrack a little to find us. After a while, the man didn't come by again, so we stayed and spent the remaining daylight hours relaxing. No one else drove by. Whether those 2 people had anything to do with what happened later, the real scare came much later. We had gone to sleep in our tent, and around 3 a.m., we were startled awake by an incredibly loud noise. I can't describe it well or even remember exactly what it sounded like, but my fiancé said it reminded him of a chain gun starting up. Another way he described it was that it sounded like someone had recorded the noise of a shovel being dragged over gravel and played it through a loudspeaker. He jumped up and looked out the small tent window but couldn't see anything. The noise happened a few more times. I was too scared to speak, so my fiancé whispered that it was probably far away, and I should go back to sleep. I didn't question it, thinking that loud noises could easily carry from miles away. After we left, he admitted that it had sounded like it was coming from just down the road, but he didn't want to scare me. Looking back, I probably should have questioned why he felt the need to whisper if the noise was supposedly far off. I was still terrified. Every small sound outside seemed like footsteps around the tent. We laid there for a while until my fiancé finally told me to get dressed because we were leaving. I became more alarmed when he unwrapped the machete we had bought for the trip before opening the tent. We quickly packed up and loaded the car. I looked around for any footprints that weren't ours, but even though the moon was bright, I couldn't see any. I did notice something my fiancé hadn't seen before we got in the car. A beer can buy our extinguished fire that hadn't been there earlier. We didn't even bring any beer. As we drove away, my fiancé explained that he was worried someone might have been trying to lure us out, so he didn't think it was safe to leave the tent right away. He also half expected our gas tank to have been siphoned, but that wouldn't have stopped us because we were driving a hybrid car. We joked about how that would make a great hybrid commercial. Number of near-miss murders avoided by driving a hybrid, 2. We only joked because we were still terrified and running on adrenaline. For the rest of our trip, we only stayed in well-populated campgrounds or opted for hotels. The woods murmured secrets, its shadows swaying with a haunting charm as I ventured further into its depths, guided solely by the faint light of the moon above. Each step resonated ominously, echoing through the thick undergrowth like a solemn beat. The air was heavy with anticipation, carrying the scent of wet earth and ancient decay. I had always been drawn to the quiet of the forest, but tonight, the usual calm felt unsettling, as if the trees themselves harbored dark intentions. Despite the unease gnawing at the edges of my awareness, I pressed on, driven by an unexplainable urge to explore the unknown. The canopy above thickened, devouring the moonlight, plunging the forest floor into a deep darkness. Branches twisted and curled like bony fingers, reaching out to trap the unwary traveler. My heart raced faster, a primal instinct warning of hidden dangers just beyond the shadows. Suddenly, a rustling sound broke the silence, sending shivers down my spine. I froze, my breath caught in my throat as I strained to locate the source of the noise. But the woods kept its secrets hidden, wrapping me in a stifling embrace of uncertainty. I stumbled forward, each step echoing like a loud crash in the overwhelming stillness. A sense of dread thickened the air, growing with each moment like a sinister mist settling on the land. And then I saw it. A brief movement in the darkness, as fleeting and elusive as a puff of smoke. My pulse quickened, dread settling in my gut as I realized I was not alone in the depths of the forest. Eyes gleamed in the shadows, shining with a strange hunger that sent a chill through me. I tried to run, to escape the unknown terror lurking in the darkness, but the woods seemed to conspire against me, twisting and turning like a maze with no way out. Panic gripped me, threatening to consume me as I stumbled deeper into the heart of the darkness. Time lost all meaning in the suffocating embrace of the forest, its twisted branches trapping me in a nightmare of despair. Each moment stretched into eternity, a relentless torment of fear and uncertainty that threatened to tear me apart. And then, just when I thought I couldn't bear it any longer, I heard it, a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the ground like a primal drum. My blood ran cold, terror flooding my veins as I realized the true danger that lurked in the shadows. I turned to flee, to escape the unseen horror that stalked me through the darkness. But it was too late. Something ancient and primal lunged from the depths of the woods, its eyes burning with a deep hunger that filled me with terror. I screamed, a raw cry of agony and despair that echoed through the silent night. But there was no rescue to be found in the heart of the forest. The darkness swallowed me whole, consuming me as the world faded away. And so, dear reader, take heed as you venture into the unknown. For in the heart of the forest, where shadows dance and whispers linger, there are horrors beyond imagination, waiting to claim the unwary traveler as their own. It was the middle of the night when we got the call. Our team had been stationed in a thick forest for weeks, doing regular patrols and keeping watch. It was supposed to be quiet, just another routine job. But that night, something didn't feel right. The forest was too quiet, the air too heavy. I led my team into the woods, our boots crunching on the dry leaves. The moon barely shined through the thick trees, casting long, dark shadows that made it hard to see much of anything. We moved close together, relying on our training to guide us through the dark. The deeper we went, the stranger the forest felt. The usual night sounds, crickets, leaves rustling, were gone. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath. I kept my rifle close, scanning the trees, but there was nothing. Just a heavy feeling that something was very wrong. We kept going, our footsteps the only sound. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I pushed the team forward. We had a job to do. But then, I saw something that made me stop dead in my tracks. There was an open space ahead, right in the middle of the forest where there shouldn't have been one. The trees around it were all broken, snapped like twigs, and the ground was torn up like something huge had come through here. But there was no sign of what caused it, no tracks, no clues. We circled the open space, staying back, trying to figure it out. But as we stood there, I noticed something else. There were no animal sounds here either. The forest was completely silent, like it was dead, and I could feel that dead feeling crawling into my bones. As we looked around, one of the guys pointed out something I had missed. On the far side of the clearing, half hidden by a pile of broken branches, was a small, dark hole in the ground. It looked like a cave or tunnel just big enough for a person to crawl through, but it wasn't on any of our maps. Even though I knew better, I moved closer, crouching down to get a better look. The hole was dark, and the air coming out of it was cold, colder than it should have been. I could see a faint glimmer of something deep inside, but I couldn't tell what it was. Whatever it was, it didn't belong there. A shiver ran down my spine, and I quickly stood up, backing away. We needed to get out of there. Whatever had torn up the clearing, whatever had made the forest so quiet, it had something to do with that hole. And I didn't want to find out what it was. We turned back, moving quickly through the forest, not even trying to stay quiet anymore. The feeling of dread that had been building up was almost choking me now. I could feel something watching us, something still out there, hidden in the shadows. When we finally reached the safety of our base, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. I didn't report what we found, and neither did anyone else. We didn't talk about it, didn't even mention it to each other. But I know we were all thinking the same thing. Whatever was out there in the forest wasn't normal. It wasn't something we could fight or protect ourselves against. It was something ancient, something that didn't belong in our world. And it was still out there, waiting in the dark. That hole in the ground? It was just a doorway. And whatever came out of it, whatever was lurking in that forest, was still out there. Watching, waiting. And I knew deep down that if we ever went back, we wouldn't stand a chance. We had only caught a glimpse of the darkness hiding in those trees, and something told me that the next time, it wouldn't let us leave so easily. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend, a small break from the tension that had built up between my ex-wife and me. We thought a walk in the forest might help us clear our heads, maybe even find some closure. The air was cool, the kind of early autumn chill that made your skin tingle but wasn't too cold. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows that moved gently with the breeze. We hadn't talked much since we left the car at the trailhead. It felt awkward, but not uncomfortable, just like things had been between us for months now. The path was narrow and a bit overgrown, but still easy enough to follow. I walked ahead, trying to focus on the trail instead of the thoughts that kept creeping into my mind. As we walked deeper into the forest, the sounds of the outside world slowly faded away. All I could hear was the crunch of leaves under our feet and the occasional rustle of something moving in the bushes. It was quiet, too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you realize just how alone you are. The tension grew not just between us, but in the air around us. After about an hour, we came to a small clearing. The trees opened up, letting a circle of sunlight warm the area. It seemed like a good spot to take a break, so we did. I sat down on a fallen log while she stood, looking around, maybe trying to find something to say. The silence felt heavy, like something important was about to happen, something we weren't ready for. That's when I noticed the footprints. At first, I thought they were ours, but they weren't. They were too big and too deep, like someone had been walking there recently, wearing heavy boots. The prints circled the clearing and disappeared into the trees on the other side. I stared at them for a moment, trying to convince myself they were old, that someone had come through before us and left them behind. But the ground was still wet, and the edges of the prints were sharp. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. We weren't alone out here. I didn't want to scare her, so I stood up and suggested we keep moving. I didn't know what I was expecting, but I knew staying in that clearing wasn't a good idea. We started walking again, this time a little faster, but the trail was harder to follow. I wasn't sure if we were still on the right path, but I didn't want to stop and check. I just wanted to get out of the forest and back to the car. The trees seemed to close in around us, the canopy growing thicker until it felt like dusk, even though it was still afternoon. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, made me jumpy. I tried to tell myself it was just animals, just the wind, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. I could feel eyes on us, something watching, following. I glanced back and saw her eyes darting around. Wide with fear she was trying to hide. She felt it too. We picked up the pace, almost running now, but the trail was gone, swallowed up by the undergrowth. I led us in what I thought was the right direction, hoping to find the path again, but it was no use. We were lost. My heart was pounding, and I could barely hear anything over the sound of my own breathing. I didn't want to admit it, but we were in trouble. The forest was like a maze, every direction looking the same, and every tree hiding something just out of sight. Panic started to creep in, but I pushed it down, trying to stay focused. I had to get us out of there. Then I saw it. A quick flash of movement in the trees ahead. It was fast, almost too fast to see, but it was there. I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath caught in my throat. I strained my eyes, trying to see what it was, but the forest was still again. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had seen. Maybe it was just an animal, a deer or something, but I knew it wasn't. It was something else, something that shouldn't have been there. We were being followed. I didn't say anything, didn't want to make her more scared than she already was, but I could tell she knew. We started moving again, faster this time, practically running. I kept looking back, expecting to see something behind us, but there was nothing, just the trees and the shadows, closing in around us like a trap. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs felt like they'd give out. The forest seemed endless, every turn taking us deeper into its grip. And then, just when I thought we couldn't go any further, we stumbled onto the trail. It was right there, like it had been waiting for us. Relief washed over me, but it was quickly replaced by a new sense of dread. The footprints were back, fresh, deep, and leading in the same direction we were going. We didn't have a choice. We had to keep going. The sun was getting low, and the last thing I wanted was to be out there after dark. We followed the trail, the footprints always just ahead of us, like someone was leading us on. I didn't know where we were going, but I knew we couldn't stop. Not now. The trees began to thin, and I could see the faint outline of the parking lot through the branches. We were almost there, almost safe, but the footprints didn't stop. They continued past the trailhead, past our car, and into the darkness beyond. Someone had been waiting for us, someone who knew we were there. We reached the car, and I fumbled for the keys, my hands shaking. I didn't look back, didn't want to see what might be standing in the trees behind us. As soon as the doors were unlocked, we jumped in, slamming them shut. I started the engine and floored it, gravel spraying as we sped out of the parking lot. As we drove down the road, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something chasing us. But there was nothing, just the empty road and the fading light of day. We didn't speak on the drive back, the tension in the car thick and heavy. When we finally reached her place, she got out without a word, and I drove away, the fear still clinging to me like a cold, wet blanket. I haven't been back to that forest since. I don't think I ever will. Some things are better left behind, buried where they belong. But sometimes, late at night when I'm alone, I think about those footprints, about what might have been out there with us. And I realize I'll never really know. But what scares me the most is that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't following us. Maybe it was leading us somewhere. Somewhere we were never supposed to leave. I live in a quiet neighborhood surrounded by thick woods. It's the kind of place where you know everyone, and not much ever happens. The forest has always felt comforting to me, but lately, something has changed. A new neighbor moved in a few months ago. He mostly stayed to himself, never came out much, and no one really knew anything about him. His house sat right on the edge of the woods, almost hidden by the trees. It seemed like the perfect spot if you didn't want anyone to bother you. One afternoon, I decided to take a walk through the woods. I've done it a million times, but this time felt different. The air felt heavy, and the forest was way too quiet. I told myself I was just being paranoid and kept walking. Eventually, I ended up near the edge of my neighbor's yard, where the trees started to thin out. That's when I saw his house in the distance. As I got closer, I noticed something strange. The ground was covered with footprints. They weren't normal footprints, though. They were deep, like someone was carrying something really heavy. The trail led from the forest straight to the back of his house. My curiosity got the better of me, so I followed the footprints. They led me to a small clearing behind his house. That's when I saw it. A large, fresh pile of dirt. It looked like a grave. My heart started racing as I realized what I was looking at. I took a few steps back, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. The footprints, the pile of dirt, it all pointed to something bad. I wanted to turn around and act like I hadn't seen anything, but I couldn't. I turned and hurried back the way I came, trying to stay calm, but my mind was spinning. What if he saw me? What if he knew I had figured something out? I made it back to my house and locked the door behind me, breathing hard. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every little noise made me jump, and I kept imagining my neighbor standing outside, watching my house. I started to realize how little anyone knew about him. He could be anyone, a criminal, a killer, or worse. Over the next few days, I noticed more strange things. My neighbor started coming out of his house more, but he always seemed to be watching me. Every time I left the house, he was there, just standing and staring. Felt like he was sending me a message. I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. The thought of what might be buried in that pile of dirt wouldn't leave my mind. I had to do something, but I was scared. What if he found out I was onto him? What if I was next? One night, I decided to face my fear. I grabbed a flashlight and headed back into the woods. It was dark, and the forest was creepily quiet. I made my way to the clearing, and there it was, the mound still untouched. As I stood there, I felt like someone was watching me. I slowly turned around, and there he was, standing at the edge of the trees. My neighbor. He didn't move, didn't say anything, just stood there, staring at me with those cold, empty eyes. I froze. My mind raced with thoughts of what he might do, but he didn't move. It felt like he was waiting for something or daring me to do something. Without thinking, I turned and ran, not stopping until I was back at my house. I locked every door and window, trying to calm down. My heart was pounding, and my mind was screaming at me to leave, to get out of the neighborhood and never look back. The next morning, I packed up my things and left. I didn't tell anyone why, just that I needed to move. As I drove away, I couldn't help but look back at the forest, wondering what was really buried there, and who my neighbor really was. I never went back. But even now, miles away in a new city, I can't shake the feeling that he's still watching me, waiting for the day I let my guard down and he can finally catch up to me. The memory of his cold, empty stare haunts my dreams, and I know that as long as he's out there, I'll never be safe. Sometimes, late at night, I wake up with the feeling that someone's in my room. I sit up, heart pounding, but no one's there. But I know it's just a matter of time before he finds me. The truth is, no matter how far I run, I can't escape him. And one day, when I least expect it, I'll wake up to see those cold eyes staring back at me from the darkness, and I'll know that he's finally come for me. I was hiking alone in the forest, hoping to find a quiet spot where I could take some photos of the untouched scenery. The day had started off bright and sunny, but as I went deeper, the trees got denser and the light started to fade. I followed a narrow path with my camera hanging from my neck, listening to the crunch of leaves under my feet. As I went further, it felt like the forest was closing in on me. The usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves disappeared, replaced by an eerie silence. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I stopped to take a photo of a huge oak tree, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease. Out of nowhere, I heard a soft but clear sound of twigs snapping behind me. I spun around, but the forest was empty. I tried to calm myself, thinking it was just an animal. Still, every now and then, I thought I saw something moving in the corner of my eye, but when I looked, there was nothing. As dusk began to set in, I realized I was no longer on the trail I started with. The trees looked unfamiliar, their shapes distorted by the fading light. I took out my map and compass, but the forest seemed the same in every direction. My phone had no signal, and my attempts to call for help went unanswered. Fear started to take over. I tried to retrace my steps, but every turn seemed to pull me deeper into the forest. What was once a welcoming place now felt like a maze, and the growing darkness made everything seem even more frightening. I could hear strange sounds that didn't belong, like something or someone moving just out of sight. I pushed through the dense underbrush until I came across a small clearing. In the middle was a makeshift fire pit with some old, burnt logs. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, but I wasn't alone. A cold shiver ran down my spine when I saw something odd. A set of footprints leading away from the pit, and they were too big to be mine. They looked fresh. Panic surged through me, and I bolted through the darkening forest, branches tearing at my clothes. I could hear something or someone moving behind me, getting closer. My heart raced as I burst through the trees and saw the edge of the forest ahead. I stumbled onto a small road and waved frantically at a passing car. The driver pulled over, and I climbed in, shaking and out of breath. I told the driver what happened. He, a local ranger, listened and then mentioned that someone had been reported missing in the area recently, a person who had been gone for days. Later, I learned that there had been signs of someone living out there, but they never figured out who it was. The forest remained a place of mystery and danger. It turned out that the fresh footprints I had seen led to a hidden spot where a person had been hiding, possibly watching me the whole time. I never went back to those woods. The thought of what might still be lurking there, waiting in the shadows, was enough to keep me away forever. The forest was no longer a peaceful place for me. It was a haunting reminder of the unknown dangers that could be hiding just out of sight. I've always loved hiking in the forest. It was my way of getting away from everything, a place where I could clear my head and enjoy some peace. The forest felt like a second home to me, with its tall trees, the soft sound of leaves moving in the wind, and the occasional snap of a branch underfoot. But this time, something felt different. I decided to try a new path, one I hadn't walked before. It was early morning, and the sun had just started to rise. The air was cool, the sky a light shade of blue, and everything seemed perfect. As I walked deeper into the woods, the trees started to get closer together, and I noticed the birds had stopped singing. The path, which had started out wide and clear, began to narrow and become harder to follow. The silence started to stand out after a while. There was no wind, no sound of animals, not even the distant noise of a plane. Just a heavy, pressing quiet. I kept walking, telling myself it was just because I was far from any roads or people. But as I went on, I started to feel uneasy. The path was barely visible now, more like a thin line of trampled grass than a trail. I pulled out my phone to check for a signal, but there was nothing. No bars, no connection. I wasn't too worried, though. I was sure I could find my way back when I decided to head home. After what felt like another hour of walking, I came across a small open space. In the middle was an old, rusty car. It was strange seeing it out here miles away from any road. The car looked like it had been there for years, with weeds growing through the broken windows and moss covering the hood. The tires were flat, and the paint was peeling away in strips. I walked around the car, noticing the ground was disturbed around it, like someone had been there recently. But there were no footprints, no signs of anyone nearby. The air felt heavy, almost like it was hard to breathe, and I suddenly felt the need to leave. I decided it was time to head back, but as I tried to retrace my steps, nothing looked familiar. The trees all looked the same, and the path I thought I had been following seemed to have disappeared completely. I kept walking, trying to find anything that I recognized, but everything looked different in this part of the forest. As the hours passed, I started to panic. I was completely lost. The sky was beginning to darken, and I knew I didn't have much daylight left. I kept moving, hoping I'd eventually come across something that would guide me back. That's when I found it, another open space much like the first. But instead of a car, there was a small, run-down cabin. It was almost hidden by the trees, the wood dark and rotting. The door was slightly open, and a faint, rotten smell was coming from inside. I knew I should keep walking, but I was so tired and desperate. I needed to rest, even if it was just for a moment. I stepped inside, the wooden floor creaking under my weight. The cabin was empty, except for a few broken pieces of furniture and a thick layer of dust. But something felt off. It was the kind of place that looked like it hadn't been touched in years, yet there were fresh footprints in the dust. I backed out of the cabin, my heart pounding. The forest felt different now, more threatening, more dangerous. I started to walk quickly, almost running, as the last light of day began to fade. I wasn't sure where I was going, but I had to keep moving. Then I heard it, a sound I hadn't heard all day, a branch snapping behind me. I froze and listened, holding my breath. The silence returned, even deeper than before. I told myself it was just an animal, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. I started running, not caring which direction I was going. I just needed to get away from whatever was out there. The trees blurred past me as I ran, my breath coming in short gasps. But no matter how far I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. Finally, I saw a tree I recognized, one with a strange, twisted trunk that I had noticed on my way in. Relief washed over me as I realized I had somehow found my way back to the main trail. I kept running, not stopping until I reached the edge of the forest, where my car was parked. I didn't look back as I drove away, the image of that cabin and the feeling of being watched still fresh in my mind. I haven't gone back to that forest since. The place that once felt like a safe escape now felt like a trap, a place where things weren't what they seemed. A few days after that hike, I couldn't shake the feeling, so I did a bit of digging. I found out that several people had gone missing in that forest over the years. The strange part? Many of them were last seen heading down the same trail I had taken. None of them were ever found. And every night since then, when I close my eyes, I see the outline of that cabin and feel that same heavy silence. It's like it's calling me back, daring me to return. But I know if I do, I won't come back out.